Australia, the land of Vegemite, dangerous animals, and cost of living pressures.
Hang on, cost of living pressures?
Yes, cost of living pressures. The price of everything has gone up recently. Transport, energy and gas, housing, and most importantly, food and bread.
You know, throughout history, increasing bread prices has been a major cause of crises, including regime changes and revolutions. To name a few, the French and Russian revolutions both had food shortages as a main contributing factor. In the South during the American Civil War, food shortages prompted riots in Virginia. Similarly, in Egypt in 1977, spontaneous uprisings emerged as a result of the unaffordability of bread. Most recently, Sudan's bread crisis in 2018 caused major demonstrations against the government. It could be the case that food shortages in Australia lead us towards similar scenarios, where the response to such a drastic crisis could be a significant change to the structure of our government or a regime change so we can afford bread.
Are you saying that Australia's heading for a revolution?
Not definitively, but it's definitely worth looking into.
Then let's investigate just how similar Australia is to one of these bread revolutions.
How about we compare Australia's current situation to the French Revolution? A backwards regime, pushed to its limits by food shortages and poverty, where ordinary people caused one of the first forms of constitutional government to emerge. Given that Australia is a democracy, it could prove to be a highly interesting case study.
Let's start with some general context. France was ruled by an absolute monarch, King Louis XVI, under the Ancien regime, which is French for ancient regime. During the Ancien regime, the people were organized into estates. The first estate were the clergy, who were part of the church. The second estate were the nobility, who were born into their positions. Both the first and second estates were exempt from taxation. The third estate was comprised of two classes, the bourgeoisie and the peasants. The bourgeoisie were philosophers and intellectuals, while the peasants worked on the land or in towns. The third estate had to pay taxes, with the majority of the burden being placed on the peasants.
The inequality of the Ancien regime can be seen in this political cartoon, published by a French cartoonist in 1815 following the French Revolution. The cartoon depicts then King Louis XVI, a bishop and a member of the aristocracy riding on the back of a man on his hands and knees and in chains, representing the Third Estate. The cartoon is insightful into the backwardness of the Ancien regime, as the lower class was underprivileged and exploited despite being the backbone of French society.
There's no way this source is reliable. It's a political cartoon. Its purpose is to engage its viewers, which it does by mocking situations. Also, isn't this investigation about bread? How is this cartoon useful to our investigation?
Well, whilst this cartoon has exaggerated visual elements, the cartoon originates from a first-hand perspective of the course of the revolution and accurately demonstrates the injustices of the Ancien regime. As for bread, the unjust taxation system meant that people were spending half their daily wage on bread. This figure shot up to 88% after two successive years of crop failures in 1788 and 1799, which was blamed on the ruling class for a resulting famine and economic upheaval.
Doesn't that feel familiar? The rising prices for food and subsequent increasing difficulty in affording to live? Let's look back home. Did you know that the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission published a report on the 28th of March 2024 that detailed how lower income Australian households were spending up to a quarter of their net income on groceries, as well as skipping meals to feed their children properly? This is corroborated by the difference between Australian food inflation, which reached about 10% for the two largest supermarkets in Australia, and wage growth, which only reached 3.5%. That's a 6.5% difference, which must be made up from other parts of a household's budget. These statistics are highly insightful into the growing unaffordability of food in Australia.
Another thing to consider is the wealth shares of Australia compared to the Ancien regime. In pre-revolutionary France, the Third Estate, who accounted for roughly 90% of the population, only held around 10% of the wealth in France. Australia has a lot more balanced share of wealth. Whilst the top 10% of the population shares 46% of the wealth, 54% is shared by the middle and lower classes. However, this still is not a healthy wealth share. The Gini coefficient is an important scale regarding economic equality, which is a scale between 0 and 1, where a number closer to 0 indicates closer to a perfectly fair wealth distribution in a country. Whilst Australia stands at a 0.343 as of 2018, a fairly decent score, it is still relatively high for a country as developed as Australia. A good comparison is Norway, a country with a similar cost of living, but having a Gini coefficient of 0.227, much better than Australia. So, food inflation has been quite substantial, and the share of wealth is not overly fair in Australia. So, does this mean we're on the verge of revolution?
Fortunately, there are several dissimilarities between Australia and pre-revolutionary France. To start, Australia is a constitutional monarchy, and the powers of the king are significantly limited. For the most part, elected officials, voted in by the Australian public, write the laws which govern us. Regardless of class or social structure, everyone in Australia is represented by a single vote. This is in direct contrast with France's electoral body, the Estates General, which was only convened when the king decided it was necessary and significantly favoured members of the upper classes. Australia's government holds a regular vote for their local representatives in Parliament, as well as regular referendums. The Museum of Australian Democracy describes it as the gold standard of voting, the opposite of the system implemented in France. Historian Pels described the voting of the Estates General, writing how each house had a single vote, which meant that the Third Estate, despite representing well over 90% of the population, could always be outvoted by the nobles and the clergy. A deeply unfair system. This is highly useful because it highlights the difference between the social lives of Australian and pre-revolutionary French people. So the people have a lot more power than the Ancien regime, meaning the government has a lot more incentive to cater for the needs of the people. So we're not quite on the verge of a revolution, but we may see ourselves in a situation like Virginia in 1863 or Egypt in 1977 if we don't amend the inequality between food inflation and wage growth. To see the annotated bibliography for this video, please see the Word document linked in the video description.